So Jose already mentioned this. I don't know how many of you this happens, but among my friends and acquaintances, there's suddenly all these hobby virologists and hobby epidemiologists, and something to think that after browsing the internet for about a weekend or so, they know better than people who've studied these things for years and years. And I think that's a problem, even though I'm very much in favor of mass engagement, the knowledge of the many and all these things. I think we need to acknowledge the reality of differential expertise. And what the crisis makes so visible is that we really depend on highly specialized expertise by many, many other people. And at the moment, the focus is very much on the knowledge of virologists and epidemiologists. But what about the knowledge of those who know how to clean a hospital room in a way that really, kills all the germs there? What about the knowledge of those who know where you can provide toilet paper on the European markets? So we suddenly had Polish and Italian brands of toilet papers in our supermarket because other supply chains seem to have broken down. And some of these forms of knowledge may not be such that it's in principle difficult to get it, but we just don't have the time to do it in all areas. We need the division of labor. And other forms of knowledge, and epidemiology and virology are, I think, of this kind, are such that we really need, or those who acquire it need years and years, not only of acquiring theoretical knowledge, but also of practical training, practical expertise. There is a dimension of tacit knowledge and experiential knowledge in these professions. And it's simply impossible to run modern societies as we know them without a division of labor, which also means a division of knowledge. And that creates a very deep sense of dependence that is in pretty stark contrast to the ideals of autonomy and self-sufficiently thinking for oneself, as Kant put it in 1804 in the famous Enlightenment text. And it's quite interesting to see that the resistance against the measures seems to come in particular from angles where people have an overblown, exaggeratedly individualistic understanding of autonomy. Elizabeth Anderson talked about this in a webinar 2 weeks ago, I think, about the Michigan protesters, which are in her part of the United States, that there is a sense of self-sufficiency, of conquering the world with your weapons and so on, that is very difficult to square with the image of vulnerability and dependence on others that this crisis reveals. And I mean, I would say the crisis has made it clearer and more visible, but this dependence is actually there all the time. And so when we think about the relation between knowledge and democracy, we really need to start from this assumption that we always, all the time, are mutually dependent on one another, and none of us is epistemically self-sufficient. And also, I mean, sometimes you then get these arguments about, oh, we have markets, and markets deal with local knowledge in the perfect way. No, markets don't, because markets leave out lots of information, and where they function well, they actually often rely on epistemic infrastructures like, for example, public regulation, where health and safety standards are written and so on, and updated when new evidence comes in. So it's simply not true that all forms of knowledge are processed very well in markets. So if you take this fact of dependence, the question is how to conceptualize it. And I want to suggest that we should understand it as a relationship of trust, not merely reliability. And I was reading Annette Bayer's classic paper on trust recently, where she argues that trust is a moralized notion, and we can blame someone when they violate our trust, which is different from reliability. And she has this funny example where she talks about the neighbors of Immanuel Kant, who apparently went for his daily walk exactly at the same time every day, so they could use him as a kind of clock, but they could not have blamed him if one day he would not have gone for his walk, and there was no moralized expectation there. Whereas when you talk about trust, the assumption is that those who are trusted have a responsibility to care about the goods that are entrusted to them. So I think that's how we need to understand the way in which we depend on the expertise of others. And I mean, in the corona crisis, it's really very basic goods, our life, our health, our economic well-being, and so on. They are entrusted in some sense to the voices and the opinions, hopefully the well-grounded opinions of those who have a say on this. And I'm not saying we should only listen to them, but I think there are good reasons for deferring judgment on some things to those who really know more about certain areas. Does it mean that there shouldn't be any form of control? Not at all. But I think controls can only get us so far. And there's this nice paper by Herzog from '91 on the role of trust in science, where he argues that many fields have such an extensive division of labor within academic research that it's impossible to really control everything. He has particle physics as an example, where one paper has 150 or more authors. They can't all control each other all the time. And Honora O'Neill has also made this point very often. She says, yes, we need control or accountability, as she often calls it, but it cannot fully replace trust, and accountability must be organized such that it doesn't undermine trust, but rather helps us to place trust in intelligent ways. That's the way she puts it. And I think that means that there's always an element of responsibility on the part of those who are trusted with something. And many fields of expertise, and well, I guess academia is the one I know most about, are really not in a very good position to be trustworthy, because the incentive systems in recent years have all been about indicators and quantity and excellence in a very weird sense. And I mean, speaking about precarity, academic precarity is everywhere. And I think that the corona crisis is also a lesson here that we really need to de-neoliberalize academia and reduce precarity, reduce dependencies and power differentials. Imagine that a lowly postdoc, lowly in currently, and as it's currently understood, I'm not endorsing this, has a fantastic idea about what to do about the crisis, and then the professor he or she works with doesn't want to do this because somehow it wouldn't be good for the reputation of the lab or something like that. All these petty competitive mechanisms that we have in place, I very much hope and expect that in the fields that are currently working about the crisis, they will be reduced because it's such an important moment. But that's a more general thing, that because if societies are dependent on certain forms of knowledge, those who have and generate and update these forms of knowledge need to live up to this expectation of trust. Now, big question, of course, is how can all of this be squared with democracy? And I guess if by democracy you mean nothing but the simple principle of one person, one vote, or equal voice to everyone or something like that, then it really can't be squared, because with regard to expertise, it doesn't make sense to assume equality. And of course, I'm very much aware that all forms of expertise are partial, and they can be distorted, and they can be distorted by partial by ideologies or even financial interests, as Jose just towards, and that is a real problem. And I guess in all the claims by the protesters that you see in certain countries at the moment, there is a small kernel of truth in the sense that we need to hear many more voices, not only epidemiologists and virologists, but also other forms of expertise, the experiences of those who go through certain forms that the crisis takes in their lives. So there is really at the moment a danger of sliding towards expertocratic or technocratic forms of governance that are highly problematic. But I don't want to endorse any more than that from these protesters who seem to be sort of crazy in many ways. But I think we should acknowledge that democracy is more than the simple principle of one person, one vote. That's an important element, and we need this in various places, and we need much more of it in many places. But there's so much more. There is the rule of law, there are political institutions, and we have this very complex system that we tend to summarize under the term the public, media, public forum, meeting points for citizens, the ways in which information is channeled, all these things. And I would also argue that there's also a question about a sort of democratic ethos. And just in brackets, and here is the connection also to Albina's talk, I would argue that to have a democratic ethos, to maintain this, to maintain the conditions of the possibility of a democratic ethos, we need a very different distribution of material goods and of life chances and of security in our societies than we have at the moment. But as I said, I'm not going to talk about this, so let me bracket this. But I think you can make an indirect argument for a different distribution purely from instrumental epistemic considerations, if you want to. And if you understand democracy in this broader sense, then it's not so daunting to think about how dependence on various forms of expertise can be integrated. And I here want to draw on the work by Albert Dzur on democratic professionalism, but not without forgetting that other people have actually had similar ideas recently. So there's also Albert Moor's book on, he calls it, I think, critical elitism, which I think the title isn't very well chosen maybe, but it goes in a very similar direction and the ideas are actually similar. But I'll stick to democratic professionalism here. And all these thinkers are very much influenced by pragmatist ideas and ideals of how democracy can help to gather the knowledge of the many, allow for social learning processes, feedback processes, all these things. But the question then is how to get differential expertise into that picture. And a first step to do this is to acknowledge that historically, expertise has very often been used or abused as a form of power, often connected with social power, and all the debates about epistemic injustice have also a variation in the professional and occupational realm. When you think about things like the higher prestige for doctors than for nurses, all these things, I mean, those are really epistemic injustices because these different forms of knowledge are all needed. But that doesn't mean that we should imagine the epistemic realm as sort of flat, denying that there are different forms of expertise. And what these authors in this democratic professionalism literature then recommend is that we need a different attitude, in a way, an attitude of humility, but also different practices on the parts of experts. And the first step in that direction is to think about the boundary between experts and non-experts, not as a strict wall, as it were, but as porous and as allowing for lots of dialogue with non-experts. And I mean, we are all non-experts in most fields of life and of knowledge, and to allow for possibilities of feedback between these different realms. And so we should integrate expert judgment into democratic forms of deliberation instead of trying to deny that they exist or rejecting them as automatically technocratic. And importantly, we need to acknowledge that there are all these different forms of expertise and they are all needed. Local expertise, manual expertise for certain things. And I mean, there are arguably many questions about which forms of expertise matter for what areas, but those are the kinds of struggles and debates we should have, not whether or not there's any expertise at all, but which expertise is relevant, always keeping in mind all the historical injustices that we have seen in this area. And Albert Dzur has a nice quote, which I'll just read to summarize or capture that approach. He says, "Being democratic as a professional means being explicit about the connections between these norms of democratic life and professional practice and being creative about making them more manifest in those organizations and institutions in which professionals have influence." So in these professional domains, try to introduce more democratic norms, more democratic practices. And the nice thing here is that this is not just an abstract postulate, but there are actually many real-life examples of how this can work. And I think one could say a lot about how science communication and communication in general during this crisis has functioned in different countries and what that means for how people seem to understand their own role as experts in democracies. But we can maybe take this up in the discussion if you like. One more observation, also something that I can keep brief because Jose already mentioned it. Many politicians and citizens would like to have the scientific answer to the question, not acknowledging that we don't have secure knowledge on these things right now. And by the way, that's an interesting difference between Corona and climate change, because in climate change, there is scientific consensus, and the results have been confirmed through many different methods, different ways of gathering different kinds of evidence and so on. So with corona, we are not at all at this stage, and that makes it more complicated. And I think it's very important to keep philosophy of science in the loop when thinking about this relationship between expertise and democracy, because philosophy of science, or philosophy of expertise, as some people have now started to call some areas, they can tell us so many interesting points about how knowledge is produced, and also how decisions can be taken based never only on knowledge, but always also about values, and how values enter into the production of knowledge and so on. So I think those are very important areas, and I think one potential benefit or positive outcome of the crisis is that the public awareness of how scientists actually produce knowledge, and how this then needs to be combined with certain value judgments in order to arrive at political decisions, that could be positive in the sense that it increases the reflexivity of democratic societies with regard to the knowledge that is used to make political decisions. Now, to conclude, I want to briefly say a few words about what this means for the kinds of citizens' engagement, mini-publics, or other participatory formats that the Democratic Constitutional Design Project, which is our host today, focuses on. And I think a first point to make here is that many of these attempts to increase participation through these kinds of formats is actually coming from experts. I mean, it's coming from academics and other experts. So in that sense, you could say those are all democratic professionals. They fall under the definition as Dzur and others understand it. But when it comes to technical issues where expert knowledge matters, there are interesting, difficult, not impossible, but hard questions about how to integrate expertise into deliberation. I mean, there are various models for this, and then there are all the debates about, okay, who decides which experts are supposed to speak in these fora and so on. But that's really an important design question. If, for example, you wanted to have some kind of online deliberation about what to do about corona, how to live with the virus for the next couple of months, then you'd certainly have to think very carefully about which expertise by which experts you'd want to integrate in these deliberations. And that's also something that citizens could and should debate about. Which experts should be involved in what areas of policy? In the German context, there was a big public debate because there had been an expert statement by the National Academy of Sciences, and there were some debates about which disciplines were involved, but then there was also a debate about the demography of these people, because I think the average age was above 50. There were only 2 women out of a group of 26 or so, and there were actually very few people from medical sciences. And so there was quite some debate. Okay, is it okay that these elderly male humanities scholars are telling us how we should organize the reopening of schools or these things? That's the kinds of debates that we need to have. And I think that is going on, and that maybe it would be a good idea to sort of channel some of these debates into some kind of citizen assembly or autocratic assembly. We have to be digital, I guess, in order to reflect more about what kind of knowledge we need to decide about all these things that, well, we will have to face to live with the virus. So I think that's a very interesting and important issue, but I also want to remind you once more of this point that I made a bit earlier, that in order to integrate scientific and other forms of expertise into democratic discourse, it needs to be understood in this trust and not reliability sense. And I think there is also a forward-looking component there, because the question that follows from that is, how can we organize our societies and the different institutions that generate different forms of expertise in a way such that we are prepared for the next crisis, and that there can be relationships of trust, but also trustworthiness. We don't know in which area the next crisis will come, and it might be a very different group of experts that will be relevant for that crisis. But in order to make societies capable of reacting to these kinds of exceptional situations, I think this question about trust and trustworthiness and the relation between citizens and experts is really a crucial one. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. And now we have asked Arne Hintz to provide a short comment. Arne, you're there? Right.
Yes, I am. Hello. Thank you very much for including me in this, and it's great, even though Iceland is not as beautiful on Zoom, but nevertheless. Yes, thank you for this thought-provoking talk. It relates to some of the work that I'm doing at the Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University about advancing civic participation and the rollout of data analytic systems and the datafication of public administration, where expertise plays a big role. But it also, and maybe I want to talk about this briefly, it also reminds me of a lot of what are some of the key problems in the I would say pretty disastrous government response to the corona crisis here in the UK. And I'm wondering how that then relates to the aspect of trust and the role of expertise. So from the beginning of the crisis here in the UK, the government has added to every single statement and every single policy, often several times a day, that what they do is based on the best scientific advice, again and again and again. This quickly became a mantra, and we can see, I think, some of the problems of the role of science and policymaking there. First, the shift of responsibility onto scientists and the deflection of criticism of government policies. Policymakers in this case have tried to absolve themselves from the consequences of their doing, of their actions, by pointing always to alleged scientific advice. Some scientists have said that they're being used by government as human shields. That was the term that some have used. And then secondly, and you referred to that in your talk, we could also see here how the composition of scientific advisory groups and the power structures in them are important. In the UK, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies is run by a behavioral scientist, is controlled in the background by a government advisor and by a campaigner, Brexit campaigner, who is not a scientist at all. And more than half the group are paid government employees. The group includes, I think, no virologists, no immunologists, no social scientists. And this composition of the group was secret until recently, and its discussions still are in large parts. And so, this is kind of a case, I think, where scientific advice has lacked critical expertise, including in many ways, as you mentioned, has also lacked transparency, and has mainly really been an exercise of shifting responsibility and of legitimizing thereby then government action or non-action. And so then my first question is, what does that mean for the understanding of trust, perhaps, and maybe more specifically then, if there are any thoughts about that, how do we avoid that? Governments will probably always have an interest in using scientific advice like that. How do we keep scientific advice independent? Maybe we could also then ask what should scientists do in these cases? Should they participate in these exercises for the purpose of damage limitation, which we can also see in the US? Or should they get out and avoid legitimizing bad policy? And then the second set of questions maybe goes to the area that you touched on in the end, how do we incorporate different knowledges, but also then how do we incorporate particularly citizens. At our project, we're very interested in, for example, how citizen assemblies and juries can be an integral part of oversight mechanisms. How can these specifically relate to each other? I don't know if there are any thoughts maybe by anyone in the group about this. And then more generally, I guess, and again, you referred to that, we could add the question, how do we make the citizen not just a participant, but a driver of policy? Should the citizen be a driver of policy in a context in which scientific expertise is needed? but often compromised, or sometimes at least compromised, in the case at least that I mentioned here. And these are some thoughts, maybe some questions for you or for everyone, and I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks, Arne. Lisa, you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are very good questions and very many questions, I think. So I'll try to respond to some aspects here, but I won't be able to cover everything. So the politicization of science that you mentioned is, of course, a very important dimension, and I just didn't include it for reasons of time. But this shifting of responsibility, I think, is a disaster. And in Germany, actually, some of the scientists who were very prominent during the crisis have actively resisted this and have said, look, I'm not a politician. I can try to give you the knowledge we have at this stage to the best of my... In German, we have a phrase that says, nach bestem Wissen und Gewissen, to the best of my knowledge and according to my conscience, which I think is very appropriate here. And they said, but we are not the politicians. And those are, in the end, value judgments. There are legal issues to be considered, social issues, so many other things. So the politicians have to make the decisions. And I think that's the right attitude on the part of scientists. And I think in the UK, maybe there was from the very beginning, I don't know much about the backgrounds, there more of a perception that certain scientists would be on the side of the Tories or the Labour Party. And I think that's a huge problem if all scientists are perceived as partisan. I think there is a role for some scientists, also in social sciences, to be more activist, and thereby they can't avoid being partisan. But if all of them take on that role, that's a huge problem. And I think more generally speaking, in the UK, there have been much more general distrust of science, and one could say a lot about this, and this people have had enough of experts quote during the Brexit campaign, all these things. I think one problem was that economics as one form of science, one field, did extremely badly before the big financial crisis, and that distrust about experts not really knowing what they're talking about was then sort of generalized to lots of other fields, which I think is disastrous. And one could also speculate to what extent the fact that the British school system and university system is so stratified and becoming a scientist is really not an option for large parts of the population may create that kind of distance that makes trust really difficult between scientists and the rest of society. On transparency and secrecy and beer competition, I mean, I don't think I would defend the claim that we always need full transparency in the sense that you make all committee meetings open and stream everything. But it sounds like what happened in the UK was on the other extreme and far too little transparency. And I mean, sometimes it may be justified to allow people to get together, speak openly, in order to arrive at compromises. So I'm not saying we should always have transparency, but I think most of the time, and in particular in the processes of selecting and appointing people, I think more transparency would probably be very helpful. And that also leads to the second question of citizens as participating and having a role in oversight and so on. I'm not sure whether we can expect like average citizens to have that kind of role. I think maybe individual citizens are really interested, could, you know, have some seats on certain kinds of committees. But I think that civil society could have a much more active role, because there you often have the kind of knowledge that in STS is called interactional knowledge. So they understand what the scientists are talking about, but they can also translate it into something that the broader general public can understand. So I would say we need to think much more creatively. And lastly, just one sentence about this idea of citizens being the drivers. I mean, that's what the representative and political system is supposed to do, because in our daily lives, especially, you know, in the crisis situation when there are so many other burdens, I think we cannot expect citizens to then suddenly also take on a huge political role. But we can expect the democratic system to be such that those who are full-time politicians are really driving things for the sake of society as a whole. And one could say a lot of things about, you know, how this is all started and how it it doesn't work so well in different countries. But I think for proposals to be realistic, we need to keep in mind a certain division of labor between professional politicians and citizens, but also think about the nexus and the possibilities of feedback and of good ideas entering quickly into the political process. And I'll stop here for reasons of time, but thank you so much. Those were excellent questions.
All right, thanks. So we have a few more questions from Lawrence Lessig, Albena, Asmanova, and Jose. So Larry, I'll ask you to come first.
Thanks. So I thought that the focus on conditions for trustworthiness is really important. And I just wanted to ask you to emphasize or talk a little bit more about sort of the economic or the financial corruption that might afflict trustworthiness. I mean, one of the most dramatic dynamics in the United States right now in the pandemic skepticism movement has been this film that I'm sure, because everybody in the world seems to have seen it, this film Plandemic. What's so striking about the film Plandemic is that it plays on this deep suspicion that many Americans have that most of the scientific recommendations that are being made for purely financial, self-interested reasons. So we see Bill Gates spending billions of dollars to see the opportunity to develop a vaccine because he wants to make money off of that vaccine. And the claim in the film is that there are these other remedies that are not being pushed or not being considered because they involve public domain resources, which would not allow any pharmaceutical company to make any money off of it, and therefore it's all about the self-interest of the financial of the pharmaceutical companies. And I think this is critical because this skepticism is there. You just have to push a button in America and draw a line between money and corruption, and people believe it. And if those on the side of science aren't more open about the way in which the influences of money corrupt their own capacity to make fair judgments, I fear that we're going to lose this debate. Because I certainly don't think Bill Gates is doing what Bill Gates is doing because he thinks he needs another $20 billion. I think he's doing it for exactly the right reasons. But I understand why especially in America, where so much research is privately funded. There are whole fields like, cell phone research, where you can't be a skeptic about cell phone radiation and get any money as a researcher. You just can't do it. And the same thing in financial services. One of the arguments about the financial crisis was that people were not able to do research about the structures of mortgage funding because they would not be able to get funding for it because the people providing the funding were so deeply invested in the particular results. So I just wonder, from an American perspective, what you said would have sounded more dire about the financial connection. I just wonder whether that's something that's as visible from the German perspective.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a huge challenge. And I think science and also the humanities these days need to really think very hard about, where are we getting our money from? I mean, I wrote my PhD on Adam Smith and Hegel, and I got all these kind invitations by Liberty Fund and Institute for all these think tanks that tried to buy. And at the time, I did not understand what was going on. And then once I understood, I stopped getting their email. But this is a huge problem. And I mean, one could say, of course, that at the root cause of that is the huge inequality, because that means that there's so much money floating around that can be used for these kind of things, and then raise suspicion. But I think there are real issues. And I think in many European countries, the situation in that respect is much better, because science as a whole is perceived as a public endeavor, is mostly publicly funded, and trust is still relatively high. And so you don't have these trigger moments of saying, oh, it's just someone's private money and they are buying the scientists. By the way, I think the expert witness system in the US has probably contributed a lot to that perception of scientists as people you can buy if you want to win a legal cause and so on. But so I'm totally on board with all you said here, but let me add one more dimension that you haven't touched upon, which is that, so we tend to think about the unequal distribution of capital as being financial, but I think Bourdieu had a really deep point when he said capital has many dimensions, and I think the unequal distribution of the social and symbolic capital between scientists and others, that's also a huge problem. If scientists are always these sort of urban left-wing people who know certain kinds of movies and so on, and they have a certain kind of social capital, symbolic capital, certain kinds of networks that feel inaccessible to others, and they feel one of us could never be one of them. I think that's also very detrimental for the kind of trustworthiness that you need between experts and the rest of society. And yeah, I'll stop here, but I think we should think about these unequal distributions that create suspicions more broadly than just the financial one. The financial one is huge, and especially in the US, I mean, it's obvious, but I think there are even more dimensions to it.
Right, thanks. We have not much time left, but Jose and Albena wanted to ask something. So maybe if you could just ask your questions very briefly and get a very brief answer to them, then we would manage. So,
do you want to combine the questions and then I'll try to answer?
Yeah. Albena, if you would go first.
Yes, thank you. Back to the issue of responsibility, I think we should always keep in mind that there is a difference between rule which is democratically responsive and socially responsible. So there is, especially on the left, this instinct to overburden democracy with more than we should, and therefore play the neoliberal game of dumping the responsibility. So the public authority has the responsibility for socially responsible rule. That means that public authority needs to take into account the social consequences of any policy decision. We cannot outsource this to the public. We cannot play the democratic card and say, oh, this is the responsibility of the public. So that's all I wanted to say in terms of, let's not forget that it is not just about expert opinion versus democratic opinion. It is how this should feed into socially responsible political rule.
Thanks. Jose, you want to?
Yes, very shortly. I agree with much of what you said, Lisa, as you know, because we were quite aligned on the same line. So I just wanted to know, you mentioned that at some point organizing citizens' assemblies or other kind of mini-publics would be a good idea. I would like to know also if you would be keen on organizing more open forms of crowdsourced decision-making. Because I see all the strengths of citizen assemblies in terms of being widely representative. And that also amounts to the thing that you mentioned regarding how urban elites might be overrepresented in some places and so on. But at the same time, I also think that, I share with Cristina Lafont some of the concerns about this mini-publics. That's why I think we should have a wider understanding of different varieties of participation. Would you agree with that?
Lisa.
A very short answer would be yes and yes. I mean, to Albena, I already said we need to keep a division of labor in mind, and we cannot expect that citizens do everything. And the worst version of that would be to blame the public or whatever if something doesn't get done, for which we have actually elected politicians and public servants and so on, that they should do this. And to Jose, absolutely. I don't think that mini-publics can replace other mechanisms. I think we continue to have questions about public discourse in general, how that can be improved. Also how the very basic representative institutions that we already have could become more representative of society again, and not distorted by money and social status and being part of the urban elites and so on. I mean, I think in most European countries, almost only people with academic degrees are members of parliament, that's a problem. If only part of the population goes to university and parliaments are only sort of open or are perceived as only open to people who've gone to university. So I think mini-publics can be an additional interesting element that could play a role somewhere, but you really then need to think about how they will be integrated, how the outcomes will be integrated into other institutional and public discourses. Because if you if you have a toxic press landscape and bipartisan politics, you organize a citizen assembly and they're going to completely distort the message in the media and ridicule participants and so on. And so, you can very well imagine a well-intended mini-public going completely wrong because the broader environment just doesn't want it, doesn't understand it. So I think we need to think about reform concerning the epistemic dimensions of democracy in the broadest sense on a much broader scale than just inserting a few autocratic institutions somewhere. It's like universal basic income in other areas. I never think that one institutional change is going to address all problems. You really need to think much more multidimensionally.